So you described in your blog post that you're sitting in a glass wall meeting room having a meeting at 10 a.m. on June 27th of 2017. Describe for me what was that day like? What was that meeting about, and what happened next?
So I wondered how long it would take. My hairs are already going up on my arms. It was an entirely normal pedestrian sort of day,
That is the voice of Gavin Ashton. Gavin is an expert in identity and access management. Almost 5 years ago, Gavin had a role in one of the most devastating, strangest, and unprecedented global cyber attacks that's ever occurred. The incident is known by the ransomware, or at least the purported ransomware, that caused it, which was called NotPetya. Gavin worked for the Danish global shipping giant Maersk.
And this is something I describe to customers of mine now, is that we talk about milestones and project plans and things that 3-5 year plans, etc. And the thing about ransomware or extortionware, whatever you want to call it these days, is that it doesn't really care about any of that. It could literally strike this afternoon, and that was our wake up call.
Maersk was just one of several multinational companies that spent hundreds of millions of dollars recovering after NotPetya struck. And it was just one of dozens of organizations that were touched by NotPetya. NotPetya pretended on the surface to be ransomware, but it actually wasn't. Although it displayed a ransom note that would indicate it was just encrypting files, it actually wrecked the master boot record of computers. The master boot record is the first sector of a PC's hard drive that the computer looks to before loading the operating system. There's no recovery from that sort of digital vandalism. This malware was designed to destroy. We'll get into a bit of the who and the why later, but NotPetya was extremely successful at destroying IT systems with breathtaking speed. And one component of that success involved taking advantage of weak identity and access management controls. 2 decades ago, identity and access management was a back-office IT function that no one really thought about except for the person or two who maintained whatever system was in use. Now the systems that broker access are among the most important ones to defend against intrusions, ransomware attacks, and in the extreme cases as in this one, a cyber attack by a nation state that, whether intended or not, got completely out of hand. This is the Ransomware Files. I'm Jeremy Kirk. In this podcast miniseries, I'm speaking with those who have navigated their way through a ransomware incident and learned how they fought back and what tips they can pass on to others. No ransomware infection is ever welcomed, but there's invaluable knowledge gained. There should be no shame in getting infected, but it's important to share the lessons. In June 2020, Gavin published an eloquent and highly detailed blog post describing his experiences at Maersk. He started working at Maersk in 2015 as its identity and access management subject matter expert. The piece was an in-depth look at why Maersk was so affected by NotPetya, this toxic, self-propagating malware. Gavin described how NotPetya took advantage of identity and access management weaknesses, and also how Maersk eventually improved. The piece was remarkable for its frankness, openness, and the fact that Gavin put his name on it. Tech is an industry where most people are very reluctant to talk about former employers for fear of retribution or legal trouble. To his surprise, the piece captured an audience, and Maersk didn't bother him about it.
When I posted that post, the reaction kind of blew up, and it was my sort of 2 minutes of stardom in the InfoSec world. But actually, you know what? I'd had a very normal career, and have a very normal career, really. But I'd started off as, a system admin, in a local company, local organization. Found identity and security pretty interesting.
Gavin ended up at Maersk after cycling through some partner and in-house roles, honing his skills around Microsoft's identity and security stack. The Maersk role, which was in a city called Maidenhead, about an hour west of London, was an outstanding opportunity. Maersk is one of the largest shipping and logistics companies in the world, and it has more than 80,000 employees in 130 countries. Its operations are a crucial part of the global supply chain. The job was a step up for Gavin.
Maersk was the first organization I'd worked at where you really felt the values. They were still majority family owned. The stuff that Maersk does, their history, and you go back to the Second World War and they're ferrying, picking up people out of the water and stuff. And the stories of Maersk are just huge. They're a great organization.
Bharat Halai hired Gavin. At the time, Bharat was Maersk's service owner for directory services, which included Active Directory, the all-important directory that's critical for authenticating Windows users. His role also included purview over Forefront Identity Manager, or FIM, and Microsoft Identity Manager, or MIM.
I was quite lucky that Gavin was one of the first CVs that came up, and I knew that his background came from a well-respected consultancy within the UK. And so when he came through, I spoke to him. He was very well spoken. And I guess the rest was history because he knew his technical, he had a good technical understanding of FIM and identity management.
Bharat says that FIM and MIM are good for what their missions are, identity management, but neither are great at access management. And if you roll back the clock 5 years ago, the tooling for controlling and monitoring privileged access was less refined. Gavin says the scene at Maersk was what you'd expect. The principle of least privilege wasn't generally followed. The least privilege principle dictates that user and admin accounts shouldn't have access to more resources than needed. For example, service accounts shouldn't be used across multiple applications, and end-user accounts don't need administrative privileges everywhere. At Maersk, some server administrators had access to huge numbers of other systems, Gavin says. There were some vague security baseline policies, but they weren't consistent and not really followed. All of it meant trouble if a bad actor got a hold of a highly privileged account. There were funding challenges as well, as Gavin says IT was viewed as a cost center to be minimized. He had been pushing for privileged access management controls, which are sometimes referred to as PAM, and that's tooling that can provide visibility and tighter management of who has access to what.
I guess anybody from the identity and security PAM field would sort of recognize very typical behaviors. Like a lot of organizations, security isn't the first priority. It's delivery of the business, and getting those containers around, allowing people to process, submit and process their orders, and the business end of IT. And like you typically find in many organizations, security is something that not an afterthought, but it's definitely not, it wasn't a main priority. And I found that it was a very consistent story at Maersk. They had, differing levels of maturity when you looked at different layers of the IT stack. And one of the things that NotPetya really highlighted was that, in days gone by, you could, when you operated in like a four walls environment, you had your data center and you had your office block. You'd focus on your network layer, you'd focus on your firewalls, and you'd keep yourself in your little box. That doesn't really work anymore.
The demonstration of why that doesn't work anymore was far from subtle. It started mid-morning on June 27th, 2017. Gavin was in a meeting.
I can almost imagine if we make the Hollywood version of this movie, it'd be the screens in sequence as you look down a row of desks, they go blump, 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 blump down the row. No, it's kind of, they were going black, and you were getting your little pretty sort of red ransomware message. But the interesting thing, it wasn't the message in of itself, because you think, oh, okay, so we've got some sort of issue locally. It was as the news came in over the next sort of hour and couple of hours that, oh, okay, it's not just Maidenhead. Oh, it's not just Europe. Oh, it's not just America. Oh, okay, this is global. Oh, and it's not just desktops. Oh, it's servers as well. okay, which servers? Oh, all of them. Nothing quite prepares you for that news.
The NotPetya attack occurred on the same day that Bharat was conducting the first service review with a Polish company that supported Maersk's identity management setup that included the company's support of Active Directory, MIM, FIM, and also Azure AD, which is Microsoft's cloud offering for Active Directory. Maersk had recently put that into the mix as well. Bharat had booked a room that was just behind Maersk's command and control center for the meeting. The command and control center had those big screens that monitor the shipping company's IT operations around the world.
So yeah, we were sitting in that room. We were just talking away, and suddenly I heard some very large footsteps, some very loud footsteps, should I say. And it was my peer who basically ran the desktop, the workstation services for Maersk. And if I knew that she was walking that fast and that loud, something must have been wrong. So she asked me to clear the room. So we thought, okay, we'll clear the room. Went downstairs to the canteen. And we continued our service review, and it went on for a good hour, 2 hours. I had no laptop in front of me, nothing like that. So service review finished. I thanked the vendor. They came back upstairs with me just to grab their bits and bobs, by which time something had gone wrong. You could see that people were concerned. You could see that something had happened. This is probably now about half 11, 12 o'clock on the 27th. Something had gone wrong, and I asked, what's happened? He said, well, we seem to have some issues. We've got systems go offline, and I thought nothing of it. I thought, okay, well, I'm sure AD is okay. I thought nothing of it, and carried on my usual business. It turned out that that wasn't the case, and that there had been something that happened, and you could see in the command and control center that the screens had gone black, and you had the red writing of the ransomware. At that time, I didn't know it was ransomware. All I knew that there was something there that, it could have been a failure of some sort. It never occurred to me at that time as ransomware. But it later transpired a few hours later that it was ransomware. So that's how the day started. I say day started, that was about 1 o'clock on the 27th.
Exactly what had struck Maersk was still unknown, but it was spreading incredibly fast. Within 2 hours, almost every domain-joined service or device was gone, from laptops to workstations to virtual machines to physical servers. And what about Bharat's 180 or so domain controllers and Active Directory that he initially thought were probably fine? Yep, gone. As Gavin put it in his blog post, Maersk had just been sent back to the Dark Ages. A little over a year later, the head of technology for Maersk, Adam Banks, relayed a tally of the damage to a publication called Global Intelligence for Digital Leaders, which is a publication sponsored by Fujitsu. Adam said that 49,000 end-user devices were destroyed, 1,200 applications were inaccessible, and 1,000 were destroyed. Also, some 3,500 of 6,200 servers were completely wrecked. Why was whatever was happening so virulent and so destructive? NotPetya was one potent piece of engineering. To get into its lineage, it has a similarity to ransomware called Petya, which appeared around March of 2016. Like Petya, NotPetya had its own bootloader and kernel. Once it hit a system, it would write over the master boot record with its own custom bootloader that then loaded a small malicious kernel. But rather than encrypting files, it actually just encrypted the master file table. Now, the master file table is what keeps track of what files are on a system and the metadata of those files. Encrypting that, of course, made the files inaccessible. NotPetya had several features that caused it to spread globally quickly. One, it was a self-propagating worm. Once it infected a system, it sought out other systems to infect. One of those methods used a software exploit known as Eternal Blue, which was developed by the US National Security Agency. Somehow, the agency lost control of this cyber weapon. It was leaked in April 2017 by a group calling itself the Shadow Brokers. To this day, we still don't know who that group is or how they came into be possession of one of the NSA's most powerful hacking tools. Eternal Blue exploited a vulnerability in Microsoft's server message block protocol, which is used for accessing files on other systems and connecting to printers. Eternal Blue proved so fruitful for the spy agency that one U.S. government official told the Washington Post that it was like fishing with dynamite. Eternal Blue was also used by the infamous WannaCry ransomware, which struck just a month before NotPetya. But using Eternal Blue wasn't NotPetya's only trick. It also used another exploit called Eternal Romance, which was also leaked by the Shadow Brokers, which targeted the SMB protocol. Also in its toolkit was a modified version of Mimikatz, which pulls authentication credentials from the memory of Windows systems. Between exploitation and credential harvesting, NotPetya was a razor-sharp spear. So how did this end up on Maersk's systems? NotPetya was initially slipped into a software update for accounting software that's used in the Ukraine called MEDoc or MEDoc. It's developed by a small company called the Linkos Group. The software is used by any business that does business with Ukraine. So when the malicious update went out, NotPetya was unknowingly installed by those who use MEDoc. It crippled Ukrainian organizations, but they were far from the only ones affected. FedEx, the pharmaceutical company Merck, even a Cadbury chocolate factory in Tasmania were hit. But due to NotPetya's extremely effective propagation, there were even more victims further afar. One of those was the Heritage Valley Health System in Sewickley, Pennsylvania. NotPetya jammed up systems that held patient histories and lab records, and admin systems were unavailable for a month. U.S. investigators believe NotPetya was created by Unit 74455 of the Russian Main Intelligence Directorate, also known as the GRU. The group is known to computer security researchers by a cluster of other names that include the Sandworm Team, Telebots, Voodoo Bear, and Iron Viking. In October 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice charged 6 GRU officers, who were all men in their late 20s and early 30s, with creating malware, including NotPetya. The journalist Andy Greenberg of Wired wrote an excellent book on the Sandworm Group and the immense cyber destruction it wrought with NotPetya. There have been questions if those who created NotPetya intended for it to cause so much collateral damage. Obviously, it was intended to hurt Ukraine, which it certainly did. After invading and annexing Crimea in 2014, Russia has been engaged in an ongoing deadly conflict and, for all practical purposes, has already taken a chunk of Ukraine's eastern territory. And as of early 2022, Russia appears poised to invade the country. As part of that buildup, we've already seen aggressive moves on the cyber front, including the deployment of malware that, get this, overwrites the master boot record, wipes files, and displays a fake ransomware note. But NotPetya didn't spare Russia. It hit organizations there too. That included Rosneft, which is Russia's largest crude oil exporter, Evraz, which is a mining and steel manufacturer, and Sberbank, which is one of the largest banks in Russia. Perhaps NotPetya's creators didn't anticipate just how effective the malware would be. The indictment against the 6 GRU members claims that they celebrated the deployment of NotPetya, but unfortunately doesn't say how investigators learned that. What some victims saw was a ransom note in red that said, "Oops, your important files have been infected." It went on. "Perhaps you are busy looking for a way to recover files, but don't waste your time." The note asked for $300 in Bitcoin as a ransom, but it was a ruse. When an organization gets infected with ransomware, they're usually assigned some sort of ID so that the attackers can identify the victim and provide the right decryption key. But NotPetya just created random data for that identifier, and it was essentially useless. It was impossible to decrypt the data. All of this, however, how NotPetya spread, the Russian involvement, the fact that it was fake ransomware, was unknown at the time to Maersk. Gavin says 2017 was a year that no one was really ready for.
But what surprised the whole world that year was, your WannaCry and your NotPetya. They really were. Up until that point, you'd had, major names go down every couple of years with some big event, maybe a Yahoo or a Sony, etc. But they'd been kind of sort of isolated events that would happen every couple of years. What WannaCry NotPetya did was really set that bar of, this is how it's done. And although they weren't ransomware, they were sort of malware dressed as ransomware. That's, if you draw a graph, it's then a vertical line from that point to today. And it wasn't something that you were prepared for.
Maersk needed to get containers moving again. Where do they even start? The answer is the same place where the attackers often start, Active Directory. But Gavin says recovery plans often assume that something is still available and working to serve as a basis for rebuilding. In this incident, though, Maersk had been fried.
AD, and this wasn't isolated to Maersk, and this has been true in other organizations as well. Your recovery plan makes an assumption about availability. AD is designed to be a highly resilient system. And if you're global and you've got hundreds of domain controllers, well, you might lose a country, but you'll still have AD, right? In this situation where you've just lost everything, like, okay, what do we do now? So, we were lucky in that we found a way to bring AD back, but there's organizations out there who are not, so this can really be pretty existential.
NotPetya had wiped Maersk's Active Directory out, but Bharat had one idea that was worth trying, but it was a long shot.
I asked the head of IT, said, can you just make sure you call every single site and ask them if any of them had a WAN outage at any point since the NotPetya event or before, and if they'd still been off. And so he got his local IT guys to call out to all branches and find out. And it just so happened that Nigeria had experienced a WAN outage. Lagos had experienced a WAN outage, a connectivity outage. Fortunately, the head of IT came back and said, yes, we have one site that has had a WAN outage before the 27th of June. I said, great. Can you ask them if they haven't already powered down the devices or disconnected them from the network, if they experienced the same message we are everywhere else? Lo and behold, they were not experiencing the issue. I thought, great. Now, first thing to do is bat that baby up quick before it goes.
Then Bharat says it was a matter of getting that data back to headquarters in Maidenhead.
Fortunately, none of the guys from Lagos had a visa, but we had the Central Africa head, I think it was based in Ghana. He flew from Ghana to Nigeria, picked the disk up, literally was an exchange, and then brought it back and flew it to us in Maidenhead. In parallel, we had one of his team uploading the backup to a safe location to see if I can download it as well. But due to connectivity issues, it was difficult, and it actually took more than 10 hours to do the upload, by which time we had arrived in Heathrow. And if you know where Maidenhead is, I was on them for half an hour. So he got the taxi and came to Maidenhead with the drive and handed over to myself and my esteemed AD architect colleague.
With that in hand, things were looking better, but one move Maersk made before the incident turned out to help quite a bit given the Active Directory problem. Around 2 weeks before the NotPetya attack, Maersk had moved to Azure AD single sign-on with password #sync. What that meant is even though most on-premises Active Directory copies had been wiped out, people could still authenticate into cloud-based services such as Office 365. They could still use email. One large task was how to move all of these compromised systems to a good state. Maersk had been on Windows 7, but Gavin said there was no point restoring infected systems back to that OS, so the company decided to upgrade everything to Windows 10. And so tell me about the sausage factory.
Well, what could you possibly not know just from the words alone?
The sausage factory was the term that Gavin and others used for how to move large swaths of compromised systems into a clean state using a tiered access model and privileged access management controls. Tiered access essentially means making sure that highly privileged accounts are separated from high-risk zones. Part of that task was also ensuring that what Maersk needed from a business perspective was prioritized for restoration.
That's the sausage factory. So you want to start off with, let's get AD in check, right? So whatever you want to do, there's multiple lists out there of things you should do after a cyber attack to help protect Active Directory and recover your trust in the directory. But then the issue will be is, well, okay, domain controllers and AD assets, fine, because that's a fairly limited amount of stuff. What about these, hundreds or thousands of servers? What do we do there? And you go, okay, right. So what are your business critical processes? Don't forget about IT. Walk across to the business island and say, right, you guys, which processes can this business not live without? Like, what do you actually need, on day one of recovery of the BCDR process? And then it's a case of mapping those processes back to systems that actually matter. So, whatever those systems might be, doesn't really matter. So those systems there are going to be ones that you say, okay, these ones are going to be things that we actually have to get across as quickly as possible. But the rest is still a threat. Like, until you've actually put the controls you need around your whole environment, you're still kind of at risk because you're providing lateral access paths.
Moving away from on-premises software to the cloud has strong security advantages, but Gavin says there's always going to be a minority percentage of systems that, for whatever reason, won't be moved. But there are ways to deal with those risks. And
at that point, it's a case of, okay, how do we set up ring fences around these things? How can we isolate them from an identity perspective? Make sure that we're controlling those access paths into those administrative systems that underpin those services. And you're then into this scenario where we're really trying to make AD as small as possible, right? So if you think of AD today, it's probably, in a typical organization, we've got lots of, old servers and stuff, pretty big attack surface. So as much as you can minimize that, and as much as you can commoditize how that's secured as well. I used to hear a lot about stop the rot, people in the business spinning up systems and not managing them particularly well and all the rest of it. Like, that stuff, that's really going to get you wiped out. Trying to commoditize how AD is secured. Let's control the access paths into those systems. Let's not allow service accounts to sign in interactively. Let's, do principle of least privilege. Let's use tools like, whatever your PAM of choice is, and just not leave AD quite so open.
Bharat says that prior to the attack, Maersk was using some best practices, such as separating accounts for, say, those that log into Outlook and one that's a domain admin. But post NotPetya, Maersk also tried to ensure the infrastructure was as segregated as possible.
One of the things we did was not just separate the accounts, but separate the infrastructure as well. So not physical separation, not network segmentation, but logical separation. And that was something that Microsoft developed called the tiering model, which I think was quite new in the time of when we were hit. But when we had the first 90 days after the attack, one of the things we did was to also split as much as possible the ability for domain controllers to have admin rights to servers, to have admin rights to workstations. I mean, if you think about it, why does a domain administrator need to go to manage all of the administration on the servers and the workstations that's within the domain? Not really required. And then, as an admin, how am I accessing the domain admin from my workstation? Okay, well, if I'm logging on to my workstation with my standard account and then logging on to a remote desktop session to a domain controller, then potentially that's an attack vector for my password to be compromised for the domain admin account, because you could have listeners on there. Someone could plug a USB stick reader, keyboard reader on the back of my keyboard. I wouldn't know that, right?
In June 2021, Bharat wrote this on LinkedIn. 4th year anniversary of NotPetya hitting, pretty much to the minute. Testimony to those who spent months recovering and the military-like discipline. Time to reflect on lessons learned and continuing to ensure that business and individuals stay protected from people who are hell-bent on disruption. He tagged Gavin and 19 other people. The comments are telling of the gargantuan task of rebuilding Maersk and the resilience and fortitude of those who helped. Steven Velasco was a former senior application manager at Maersk. He wrote, good times, emptying the snacks aisle of the local Sainsbury's and working together 24 hours a day to get things up and running. A unique moment to have experienced and fantastic people to work with. Dave Lanigan, who worked with the service management maturity and capability, wrote, we all made a great team, watching the sun come up in Maidenhead for the second time without barely leaving the office. And that was just the start. Kanban boards, WhatsApp, setting up crisis teams for different services. Those first 48 hours had some critical decisions to be made that were bold and brave, and this team faced up to them. I'll never forget the welfare team protecting people for working hours, meals, drinks, rest. They were sensational, even if a few of us were ducking and diving them just to try to get in a few more hours. And Mandy Sunner, a former lead business analyst, wrote, hell is bent on destroying good. Love your disciplined approach and calmness, Barrett. In your LinkedIn post, you wrote, testimony to those who spent months recovering and the military-like discipline. And then Mandy Sunner, she wrote a little bit further down, she said, love your disciplined approach and calmness. Tell me about those components, like the discipline and then also the calmness, because you seem like a really calm guy. Like you seem like you'd be somebody who's quite cool under a lot of pressure.
From a young age, I would say that I've been working under pressure, as it were. You know, like most people, bullied at school and what have you, and then suddenly when you hit puberty, you're now 6 foot tall, muscle, and the bullies don't tend to bully you. So I think I learned some resilience there. But yeah, I mean, there's not many people that I know I recall that had really lashed out or gone crazy or had got really emotional about the situation. Yes, you had some frustrations. If some vendors weren't doing what you wanted to do and didn't go your way, you could shout about it, cry about it, wouldn't solve anything. And I think that's the thing that all really pulled us together, because everyone else was calm around you. So why would I get worked up? I know that there was a hell of a lot of pressure for the first few days and weeks on me to get Active Directory, because if Active Directory wasn't back, the Windows servers aren't come back, DNS is not come back, workstations aren't come back. So one of the things that me and the architect kept telling ourselves throughout the whole thing, the words we kept uttering all the time is, it is what it is. And I mean, I wouldn't say I'm a spiritual Hindu. I am a practicing Hindu, but as you know, Hinduism generally is quite a peaceful religion. And that was just the mantra that I was having in my head all the time.
There were stressing dynamics that resulted from the attack. Remember, nearly all of Maersk's Windows systems were gone. That also meant payroll. Barrett says that there were questions as to whether everyone was going to get paid due to the outages.
We didn't know if we'd get paid or not for this at the end of the day, right? You think about it. If your company's lost all its IT, how you're sitting in an office, right, in Maidenhead, not knowing whether you're going to get paid for any of this stuff. HR did a phenomenal job to make sure that happened anyway. It was at the end of it was getting close to the end of the month. I think we may have all been paid by that time. But then the following month, obviously, you don't know if it's going to happen or not. But they knew that we were pulling up the stops. And if you know Maersk, obviously it's a family-owned Danish business. And fortunate that there's reserves there, so it wasn't too bad.
For Gavin, the incident did take its toll over the longer term. There were lots of vendors involved. There were passionate discussions over which type of privileged access management technology to use and why, discussions about prioritization, disagreements. Deloitte, one of the largest technology consultancies in the world, was heavily involved, and not every decision went Gavin's way.
And I just had a difference of opinion, which is really what it comes down to. I've got, huge admiration for like the stuff that actually happened. As I say, this is stuff that normally in an organization you talk about for years and years and years, and all of a sudden it was all just happening. So, it wasn't a simple question at all. And, ultimately the right things did happen in the end. But, my personal, reaction to all this was, having gone through all that, I was sort of desperate, just as desperate as anybody else to see the right things happening. And after 2 years, I was just burned out to a crisp.
He quit Maersk. He acquired a motorhome and took his family on the road through France, Spain, and Portugal for 6 months. But something weird and disturbing kept happening.
I had real trouble getting over all this. I left Maersk to sort of just have a break. And I felt myself thinking about it all the time. Like, even after I got another job, I was still talking and thinking about Maersk constantly. And I went to get counseling, and it turns out that it was grief. I was grieving my old job that I missed, that had been sort of torn away from me. And it was, it's a case of, I never thought I could grieve over a job. That's ridiculous.
That's fascinating. So what did you feel like was unresolved?
Well, I mean, grief is the word. Like, I can only imagine, I've not lost either of my parents yet, but like when you lose a loved one or a close loved one, or a pet, I don't know, like but it's that feeling of grief, like something had gone away and I hadn't processed it. I hadn't sort of acknowledged in my own mind, like, I really loved that job and the people I worked with and the stuff we were doing. Like, it was a really cool job. And it was suddenly it wasn't there anymore, and I guess I'd been so, busy for those 2 years in the recovery process and then building back stronger and all the rest of it. I hadn't really had time to sort of process anything. And it was only after I left and we took 6 months out to go traveling, I fell into quite a dark spot.
Time has passed and Gavin was able to move on. He now works at Microsoft. Amidst all the great advice in his blog post, there's one piece that's not only funny, but powerful. I like this quote. Business continuity plans are vital. It's obvious when you say it. But seriously, at whatever level of the organization you are, there are things you can do to plan for the worst. No, literally, the worst. No, worse than that. I mean the absolute worst you could possibly think of. Plan for that, because when it all goes bang, you will seriously thank yourself. That is wonderful advice.
I wish I followed it all the time.
Right. If you enjoyed this episode of the Ransomware Files, please share it. Also, the Ransomware Files has its own Twitter handle, @Ransomware Files, which tweets news and happenings about ransomware. And I'm on Twitter @Jeremy_Kirk. If you'd like to participate in this project or have an idea for it, please get in touch with me. My direct messages are open on Twitter and I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. I'm looking for other people, organizations, and companies that can share their unique experiences for the benefit of all until ransomware, hopefully, becomes a thing of the past.